Hello, hello. What's going on, guys? Good morning, good day, good afternoon. All my grade school people, are you all here? Rafa, are you here?
I am here indeed.
What's going on, buddy?
Well, it's been a very fun week doing color stuff for a couple of short movies. So yeah, living the colorist life.
Oh man, that's the best kind of week. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, I've been living the colorist life too. Did a little bit of traveling this week. Been doing a little bit of tool development, a little bit of grading thrown in there. So I've had a color grading and color grading auxiliary activity filled week. So no complaints here. Hope all of you guys are doing awesome. Glad to be with y'all for another freestyle episode of Grade School. So we're going to take y'all's questions as they come and we can talk about whatever we darn well please as a group this morning. So if you haven't already dropped them in there, put your questions in. What's on your mind? What are you wondering about? What's like the dumbest question that you've always been afraid to ask? Today's a really good day to ask that question. As you guys know, I really, really like dumb questions. Dumb questions are always the ones that paradoxically end up making us think the most. So that's my challenge to you this morning. If you haven't come up with your question or you're not sure what to ask, just search your mind for a second and try to think of the dumbest question, the thing you always felt too dumb to even ask, and drop it in the chat, because I guarantee if you're asking that question in some dark recess of your mind, then the rest of us are probably asking it too. And that might even include me. So I might not have the answer, but as usual, if I don't, we can explore possible answers together and think about how we might go about answering such questions. So get those ready for me. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping here on my side, and then we can dive in, guys. I know we just got started. Rafa, have we had any good questions pop up thus far?
Yeah, we have questions. For example, this one from Easy Sonka. Why, when applying the magic mask to a clip and I copy that adjustment in that clip to another one in the timeline, the magic mask gets lost?
Oh, interesting. Well, I am going to answer right along the lines of what I was just saying. I'm going to be totally dead honest with you guys for a second. I have never once used the magic mask. Rafa, have you used the magic mask at all? What's your take?
I have used it, but I don't think it's worth it because it creates like very weird edges, and the requirements on your computer are like very high to actually see the preview in the whole clip.
Interesting. Yeah, like what I've heard from, I've heard reports like Rafa's from people who I trust, including, of course, Rafa just now. I've also heard colorists who I really trust, who do good work, say, "Oh my goodness, I like love the magic mask," and that a lot of it includes. I've heard from more than one colorist that they love to use it for car spots, for getting a magic mask on the car or some portion of it. So for whatever that's worth. But to answer the specific question of, like why doesn't that trace from shot A to shot B? I assume it's because the magic mask is being driven by some sort of dynamic analysis. So the real question would be, is there a way to, once the matte has been generated via whatever AI mechanism is happening under the hood inside of Resolve, is there a way to now have that just be a static and non-changing matte that I can travel from shot A to shot B? I actually don't know the answer to that, but that would be a fun thing to explore. And if any of you guys find out, then certainly let me know in the chat today or in the comments. And that would be something fun to, if I won't do it today because it'll take more time than I want to spend. But when all else fails, the old saying, when all else fails, read the instructions. One of my favorite things about working in Resolve is the manual is really, really, really good. And even though the magic mask is a brand new feature, I guarantee you there's at least a paragraph or two in the manual about the magic mask and the way it works and how to make it do what you want. So maybe that answer is hiding right there in the manual. I don't know, maybe you've already looked, but that would certainly be my first stop for answering that question of how do I ripple a matte that is working great for me on shot A and just copy it one for one over onto shot B. Start with the manual and then see what you can uncover from there. But I hope the community will let me know if you guys discover the answer to that one, because I'd like to know as well.
All right. Another question from Ivan. I'd love to hear about file management. How do you handle transferring large files to your clients from the grading suite?
Oh, that's a fun question. Maybe not the most exciting answer, but like I would say the way that I handle that, the way we handle it here at Cullen Kelly Color is fairly standard. I don't know if we've uncovered anything particularly miraculous or magical on that front. We use a combination of services. Sometimes it's dictated by the client, and they'll say, hey, here is a portal where we want you to upload the deliverables or these assets to. Other times it'll be determined by us, and we might provide a Frame.io link. That's probably the most common. We've started using Massive more and more. That's MASV. In the last, I would say maybe 3 or 4 months for moving larger amounts of data around. Just because there are some advantages to using it in those applications. So I would say Frame.io and Massive are the most common. We also use Google Drive, either because that's what the client prefers or because it's convenient for a job that we're working on. And the other one, of course, is Dropbox, because as some of you guys may know, we've moved over to using a cloud store here at Cullen Kelly Color. So it's pretty neat. We've got really fast local network attached storage basically via the cloud store, but then everything is also syncing to the cloud so that we can onboard and bring artists in to support or to take the lead on any particular project, and they can be anywhere in the world. And as long as they've got a couple of bare minimum hardware pieces on their side, they can get all of their media syncing via Dropbox from our Dropbox account down to their local side. So that's another service that we use more internally. I don't think, to my knowledge, we don't do as much of sending the client a Dropbox folder to drop assets into, or certainly doing turnover or deliverable of our final assets to the client via Dropbox. But we are using it a ton internally now. So nothing that exotic, I don't think, but that's kind of the host of options that we are currently using for that stuff here at my company anyway.
All right, a question from Ruth Joshim. What is the difference between additive color and subtractive color?
Ooh, this is a fun question to talk about. So I'm going to try to not turn this into like a 1-hour conversation, which we definitely could. But here's how I would frame the conversation about additive and subtractive color. Give me just 1 second. My second screen continues to act up. I don't know if the gods are against me or what, but I need that second screen. So let's talk about subtractive versus additive color for a second. So let's ground ourselves a little bit and just think about the fundamental ideas that we are talking about when we refer to subtractive or additive color. Generally speaking, we are thinking about subtractive versus additive color in tight alignment with thinking about video or digital acquisition versus film acquisition. So let's just think about, or even just film versus digital systems in general, okay? So let's think about 2 scenarios for a second. This is going to help ground this conversation. If you think about an additive system, an example of an additive color system would be a projector, a digital projector, that is, in a movie theater, right? It has the ability to produce different combinations of red, green, and blue. They're going to bounce off your screen and you're going to see, right? As you increase your red, green, and or blue, you're going to get a brighter image, right? So if you wanted to get a field of the whitest white, the purest white that projector can reproduce, you would set your red to 100%, your green to 100%, your blue to 100%, right? That's how you would get there. You would literally add up all of the color that the system is capable of reproducing, and you would end up with the brightest white that system can get. That's additive color. Now think about that same movie theater, and we're going to throw that digital projector. Well, maybe we won't throw it in the trash. Let's just set it aside for a moment, gently, so maybe we can use it again. And let's think about a film projector by contrast. A film projector has a bulb, right? That bulb is going to shine through a film print. So what's the brightest thing that system can reproduce? Well, that would be a film print that's completely transparent, that emits 100% of the light that it's receiving from the back end. It transmits all of that light straight on through and onto the projector screen, right? No such thing in any piece of printed film as 100% transmittance in that sense, but that would be the brightest thing that we could do. Now think about that same film print and think about a single frame on that film print of, I don't know, you photographed a pure red wall. So that frame is just nothing but pure red, the reddest red that that system can reproduce. Is that frame of pure red going to be brighter or darker than the first thing that we just talked about, than just the light shining through? It's going to be darker, right? Because this is a subtractive system that we are in now, meaning that as we add color, whether that's red, green, or blue, and in the case of a subtractive system, we're really talking about cyan, magenta, or yellow. As we add color, we are directly decreasing how bright we can possibly get. So in that context, it is not a sort of like stylistic election or choice. It's inherent in the subtractive versus the additive system. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense when we talk about simplest, most basic, most unopinionated concept of subtractive versus additive. That's what I mean. In an additive system, you literally add up the colors in that system and you get white. In a subtractive system, you get white with the absence of color. And as you add color, you're going to lose your output level, if that makes sense, okay? And generally, we tend to think about those things, as our example just indicated, in terms of like video versus film reproduction systems. So that's the fundamental difference there. And the reality is, when we're talking about digital video, like, I don't know if I have that much of a enthralling demonstration that I can make here today, but when we're talking about a video system, which of course I'm in right now, everything is in an RGB mode and everything by default is additive. So simple example, we talked about this in the cinematic saturation video. If I'm here on Isabella, and let's just make this a little bit bigger so it's easier for you guys to see, and I just grab my vanilla saturation knob here, that's a pretty good example of additive saturation. You can even see on my waveform, the overall level of my image is sort of increasing, right? That's additive color. How could we get anything but that with a system like this? Because we're in RGB, we're in digital. We are headed for a screen where the properties that we talked about for that projector are the same. If we want to get brighter, or if we want to, conversely, if we want to add color, we have no choice but to add some combination of red, green, and or blue, which means that the image is going to get brighter, right? But we actually can do something different by moving ourselves into a different model, as we talked about in the cinematic saturation video. So if I switch myself over to HSV, for example, set my channel only to channel 2, which would be the S or the saturation channel of HSV, and then I go and I apply gain to that S channel, like so, I'm getting color that as it increases, it's actually getting darker. You can almost see it in the traces of my waveforms here. If I move this out, make it a little bit bigger maybe, you can actually see. So here's neutral. You can actually see like here and here, especially in the red and the blue channels, the signal is being driven downward because of the model that I'm using. And that's just one such subtractive model that I might use to get subtractive color. But I'll confine my mini lecture on subtractive versus additive color there, but that's the idea, is what subtractive color is, what additive is in its most basic sense, and just throwing the one initial idea out there that even though when we're talking about digital capture and/or reproduction, we are in a quote-unquote additive system all the way through, we can move into a subtractive system by modeling it properly and applying the right manipulations at the right point in our chain. And oftentimes we find those to be more pleasing and maybe more filmic in character.
All right, I have two questions here regarding the gamma wheel. From Isisonka, the first one, what is the best approach to use the gamma wheel? And another one from Gihon, any tip if the film stock is not exposed properly and I need to adjust middle grade? What do I have to pay attention to if I have to use the gamma wheel after all?
Yeah. Let's talk about gamma. Gamma doesn't get enough play around here on the channel. So I'm trying to think of a really good way to frame this conversation. Let's start with the basics. Let's start with the non-negotiables, the things that we know to be true. So let's just do a quick recap on what exactly gamma is. And for a moment, I'm going to go to my color management settings here, and I'm just going to turn off my output transform. Actually, better yet, I'm just going to bypass my color management. We'll make it even simpler. So right now I've just got my pure linear ramp here. And I bet I've got some smart people out here in the room who know what I'm going to see when I start to move this gamma wheel left or right. If you don't, make a guess in your own mind. What is this line going to do, this pure linear ramp going to do? What it's going to do is when I turn to the right, it's going to move things up. When I go to the left, it's going to move things down, but it's going to leave 0 and 1 pinned. And for those of you who are into the math of things, gamma is just a power function. So we are literally raising our input to the power of whatever I say here in my gamma section, like so. We're actually raising it to 1 divided by that value, but it's just a power function. And the result of a power function is that everything in between 0 and 1 moves, but 0 and 1 do not move, because 0 to the power of anything is 0, right? And 1 to the power of anything is 1. So that's kind of the mechanics of a gamma function. And that's, of course, quite different than like an offset, which we've talked far more about here on the channel. That's just moving the whole darn thing in one piece. So that's how gamma works. And in terms of when we might use it and whether we might want to use it for underexposed footage, I'm going to give you guys a philosophy to contemplate, a sort of philosophical contemplation. As I've spent my too many years in color grading and talked with lots of different people and certainly done my share of talking about the way color grading works, the way we ought to do it, the best tool for a particular task, all those kind of things that we talk about here in grade school that I'm always thinking about. I'm going to pitch you guys on 2 schools of thought that this is some raw concept that I haven't had the chance to fully refine, but you guys can let me know what you think of this, because it's something that has been becoming more clear to me lately. I am starting to see 2 sort of different schools of thought, 2 different philosophies of colorist out there, neither of which is right or wrong, but they are sort of different, and I think most of us are going to fall into 1 or 2 categories. Category number 1 is a type of operation as a colorist that will sound familiar to you guys because it's the category that I tend to belong to, where I am looking for the one specific ideal knob to accomplish the task at hand. Okay, so easy example would be, like we've talked about kind of choosing the perfect tools in the past, and we've looked at like, oh, maybe you expose with your offset, maybe you expose with your global exposure here in your HDR palette, maybe you expose with your with gain in a linear mode by switching your gamma, like so. Maybe you expose, as we're talking about right now, with gamma. It actually doesn't matter. For the sake of this conversation, it's about finding that one tool that you personally, as the artist, feel convicted is the best, most consistent, most optimal way to get the result. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a single tool. You guys have heard me share this quote before that like a good encapsulation of this philosophy is a quote that I've stolen from one of my heroes, David Fincher, who says that people tend to think there are a million ways to do things when in fact there are only 2 ways to do things, and one of them is wrong. That tends to be my school of thought. And I hope I'm putting plenty of explanation of this first category of colorist, okay, where we're looking for the one optimal tool to get the job done, and once we've found it, we stick with it, and we don't move until we have reason to believe that there's a better tool for us to switch to, okay? That's category number 1. Category number 2 is a much more intuitive and much more feel-driven and much more, I would say, messy is not a good word because I don't want to impart negative connotation. It's just more open-ended. It's not about one tool. It's about probably a group of 3 or 4 tools. The easiest example would be lift, gamma, and gain that you use intuitively and in concert, using your hands, using your eyes to arrive at the right result more by feel than by going into it with the expectation that I know I want to expose this up, and I know that my best tool from having done lots and lots and lots and lots of research is going to be linear gain, as an example from category number 1. Instead, this type of colorist, this school of thought would say, well, I know that I want this image to feel a little moodier in its exposure. So I'm going to drop my gamma and maybe pick up my lift and then maybe work my gain a little bit here and just try to feel my way to a better result. I've probably still got a finite set of tools that I'm going to use for that. I'm not going to touch every single knob on the control surface, but it's a more intuitive, more open-ended, more sort of pluralistic approach where like I'm going to use more than one tool to get there. And the way I decide which one I'm going to turn next and how much is sheerly by feel. You follow what I'm saying? You follow the distinction between those two things? There's nothing wrong with either of those. Even though I happen to fall squarely in that first category, that's me. That's my practice. And of course, what I share with you guys is going to be, pun intended, colored by that point of view. And I do feel very convicted in my practice that that's the way I practice best. I feel convicted about that. However, the reason I bring this all up now is because I feel like gamma is kind of a great place to kick off that conversation, because gamma, I think, is the first step of going like, well, what if I want something that is kind of exposure-esque, but is going to leave my shadows pinned a little bit more just because I feel like that feels better, you know, or maybe marrying that with a little bit of gain. Gamma is kind of like that first stop where it's like, gamma has no real world equivalent when we're operating in a color managed scene referred space. Like gain does when we're in linear, and offset does when we're in log. Those have, like, you could make a case that there are pretty real world analogs for those things, namely exposure, or even something like linear contrast, like lift and gain. There's a rough real world analog for that in the sense that, like, you know, let me wipe out this node. When I'm working my lift and my gain, I am basically working my contrast ratio. How bright is the bright thing? How dark is the dark thing, right? There's some kind of real world analog for that. Gamma has no real world analog. Gamma is just about the image. You follow what I'm saying? So that's why I personally don't use gamma a ton in my practice, but I know tons of artists who do. One of my heroes who comes to mind, because we had a big social media conversation about this at one point, is Tom Poole. I love Tom Poole. I think he does such good work, and he called out in that thread, what's the beef with gamma? I love gamma. So I really want to emphasize to you guys that there's no right or wrong way, that one of these approaches isn't better than the other. But I think it might be helpful for us as colorists to think about which of those do I feel most affinity with? Which of those do I want to try on, or am I aiming for? And then maybe you can try one for a while and say, no, I hate that. Let me try the other one. I think it can be helpful to us as artists to identify that gap there. And the other person who comes to mind, another one of the smartest, most talented colorists I know, who loves him some gamma, is Eric White. I talked to Eric White about gamma for a while on the episode that we did together of the Masters of Color podcast. So there's lots of gamma lovers out there, and I am nobody to tell Tom Poole or Eric White that they shouldn't reach for that knob when they're making their beautiful images. But like I said, I do think it can lead to a larger consideration of like, what kind of colorist am I? Am I the tactile, intuitive, 3 or 4 knobs that I operate mostly by feel type of colorist? Or am I the spend a gazillion hours trying to find the one perfect knob, or if it doesn't exist, build the one perfect knob to do my thing? And that's my kung fu as a colorist. I happen to fall in the first category. I want you to explore both. I want you to tell me here today, if you already know, or in the comments on future videos, which of those camps do you fall into? I think it's a fascinating question to ask. Okay, I talked about that for a while. I hope that's interesting. I hope that gives you some food for thought. I'm going to shut up now. What else we got?
We have a question from Chris asking that I found that Resolve's film print emulation and your 2383 LUT looks great on DaVinci Wet Gamut files, but terrible on GoPro or drone footage. The greens go very yellow, the contrast goes crazy. So do you have any tips for adjusting Rec 709 footage to work better beyond color management?
Well, you know, certainly, like, a couple thoughts there in terms of like grading Rec 709 material and getting better results when we're working in a color managed environment. So there is lots of variation in terms of the way that we initially map something in that you can probably find, to go to our conversation we were just having a moment ago, you can find as I have a sort of like optimal set of input parameters that work best most consistently for most Rec 709 footage. So that's an ongoing process that you can continue to explore. It's also worth noting that like when you're color grading Rec 709 material, you do need to lower your expectations a little bit because you are unpacking and reworking something in a manner that you're never going to get as good of results as if you had access to the original scene data in like a log or a linear format. So we have to lower our expectations just a little bit. But within there, we should still be able to get really good results. And I will say, just as one other sort of like top level principle, I am working really hard right now with a couple members of my community on some custom IDTs for getting better input mapping of specific camera formats where there may be a better initial color management solution that's better than just a generic Rec 709. The reason I think of that is because like the GoPro ProTune standard is one such example, and some other formats as well, like Cinetone, that might feel like, well, it is just Rec 709, but maybe we can arrive at a better, more tailored solution for that specific flavor of Rec 709, if that makes sense. So that's something else you can be optimistic about and keep your eyes peeled here on the channel for us to release more news about soon. But all those things aside, once you're in a situation where you've got your Rec 709 material color managed into your DaVinci wide gamut workflow, here's the order that I would think about things in. I would still think first always about contrast and color balance, or really exposure, contrast, color balance, those first three nodes that we always talk about here in the template node tree. So we've got, exposure, contrast ratio, and color balance, right? Would always start with those. But if, for example, let's say you're using the 2383 LUT, and let's just go ahead and build out my full, like typical node graph here. And unfortunately, I don't have any Rec 709 material handy here, which I should do something about in the near future. But for now, let's just say we want to use the 2383, okay? And I mean, actually, we did a similar exercise to this recently, but let's look at like this shot, for example, and say that even here, even though this isn't your particular Rec 709 example, let's say we don't love the hue rotation that we're getting like over here in this foliage. Let me make this all a little bit bigger. That's moving that quite a bit. It's definitely going more kind of like browny, autumny compared to the more verdant green that we're getting. The best thing that you can look at after you've got your exposure, your ratio, and your balance optimized, that's going to solve the contrast issue that you mentioned a moment ago. Something else that you can do if you really feel like, man, it's still got a lot of contrast cooked in there. I'm just going to show you a quick example of something here before I continue looking at our nodes. I don't need that right now. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is a Rec 709 source. If you are color managing in your project settings, let me just make this simple. If you're color managing in your project settings the way I am right now, something that you may find helpful in terms of your initial input and getting it into a better place right off the bat, instead of, for example, Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, you could try Rec 709 Scene or Rec 709A. Those are both going to suck more contrast out of the image than Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. They are going to essentially invert the OOTF, which imparts extra contrast onto the image. So that might be a good extra line of defense if your images are coming in overly contrasty in general, okay? But back to actually, okay, we've color managed as best we can, and now we got to, ponder this rotten assignment, as one of my favorite writers, Hunter S. Thompson, said. We got to figure out what are we going to do inside of our color management pipeline, okay? So within here, the simplest thing that I would do after optimizing exposure, optimizing contrast ratio, using either lift and gain, maybe contrast pivot. Maybe you got to get fancy and fill in those shadows a little bit. So you would go in and, like down here in your secondaries, look at like, I want to fill in this area down here. So I'm just going to get a general control point for what's above that in terms of like tone. And then I'm just going to go in and start to like lightly fill that in and then maybe scale everything back. Like you could get fancy with filling things in and more nuancy with your contrast if you needed to. But the other thing I was going to point out, because we were talking about hue and hue rotation as imparted by the film print LUT, couple things that you could do there. If you feel like you like what the LUT is doing overall, but not to your GoPro footage, the GoPro footage feels to like the foliage maybe is getting burned faster than everything else. My go-to there would be hue versus hue. Just grab for your yellow and start to rotate to the left. A little bit goes a long way. So I've just rotated, whatever, like 15 degrees. If you can read my UI, that's fairly small. And that's huge, right? Off, on, before, after. You see the difference that I'm describing there? So hue rotation is your friend. Hue versus hue is your friend in those situations. And then, of course, you could also look into a whole host of ways of tailoring or scaling or tuning your actual LUT if you were indeed feeling like, hey, just across the board, I'd like to get a slightly different behavior out of this look. But it sounds like in this case, it's more to do with the particular, in this case, like GoPro source footage that isn't taking the look as well as everything else. These would be the things that I would play with. Get that exposure, get that ratio, get that balance, really feeling good. Don't worry so much about the colors at first. And then at that point, just look at, all right, what's bothering me? And then just look at some nice, big, broad, soft adjustments that you can make to try to get things more in line with the other images from other cameras that you're liking better.
All right, a couple of questions here regarding YouTube. How do you avoid the changing colors from DaVinci Resolve to YouTube? I get different tips like using Rec 709A for output color space. And also a question from Jim Robinson. What gamma does YouTube expect for a deliverable 2.2 or 2.4? And if you send one, does it compensate for the other or just convert it without changing?
Ooh, bunch of good questions. So let's talk about delivering for web, delivering for YouTube specifically. So here's the main thing. I hate giving complicated answers, but sometimes simple answers don't suffice. So the first big question that comes up for all of us, as it should, how do I make it look on YouTube like it did in my Resolve? Why is that even a question that I have to ask? Why doesn't it just look that way, right? Well, the reason for that is because there is different color management happening, like operating system color management, not Resolve color management. Like the same way that Resolve does color management for us, Mac OS, Windows, your friendly neighborhood web browser, all kinds of other systems that are being used to deliver that final image to your eyeballs, they all have their own color management, and they're trying to do the very best job they can of reproducing the image that you've asked to be shown as accurately as possible. That's really what is going on when we see this difference in reproductions between like Resolve and, easy example, QuickTime for those of us who are on Mac, or Resolve and Chrome. So it's a challenge because we don't necessarily, it's not as simple as fixing a problem. It's getting a better system in place. The color management isn't doing what it should be doing in that scenario where you're getting a different result on your screen versus on YouTube. So that's kind of the first thing to keep in mind, is it's not just simple as defeating a bug. It's a question of like, well, the system that is supposed to be dealing with this for me is not doing so perfectly. There's a variety of different options there. To speak quickly to Jim's question about what gamma does YouTube expect, I've been hearing discussion to the contrary about this lately, but the last time I ran my tests on YouTube, which was probably early in the summer of this year, I was not able to get YouTube to respond differently to an upload, regardless of the metadata tag. So I could say, hey, this is Rec 709, this is Rec 709A, Gamma 24, Gamma 22. At that time, I could not get YouTube to respond differently to input or to remap the gamma of an SDR image different, no matter how it was tagged. It didn't seem to care. It seems to just pass that on forward, and actually to impart a little bit of an opening in the toe, which is what my web viewing LUT is designed to counter, so that you are getting closer to that reproduction of what you saw in Resolve to what you're seeing on YouTube. So that's my best answer there, that apparently deserves a quick kick of the tires, because I have heard a couple people say here in grade school that they have been able to get YouTube to respond differently depending on the metadata tags that are embedded in the file. So that's the other challenge there. But let's go back to the fundamental question of like, how do we make something that when we all sign off on it when we're grading, or when I sign off on it if I'm just one person and I say, yeah, that's my image, that looks good, ship it. I want to see that image when I like pull it up on YouTube or when I pull it up elsewhere, right? The best solution that we have for that right now, that I have anyway, is to use that web viewing LUT that I mentioned to you. So I can't make a display that is inaccurately rendering colors. I can't account for the inaccuracy or the improper handling of a YouTube video on every different device, because every different device is going to potentially do something different. There's nothing I can do about that. What I can do is ensure that what I see like in my UI in Resolve reasonably well matches when I pull it up on YouTube. And the best way to do that actually is if we go to our preferences. I don't know what the corollary for this exactly is in Windows, but if we go here and into our general, and this option right here, use Mac display color profiles for viewers, you can play with turning this on if you want to. And that may get you a closer match to what you're looking at when you look at it in your web browser. But the main thing to keep in mind is getting a match on YouTube, on your screen or on some other screen, to what you saw on your GUI monitor. If that's what you're talking about, you have to question how meaningful that is. What I care more about, here's my like use case, my example in my context. When I'm grading, my reference monitor is right over here to my right. You can't see it, but take my word for it. That's the image that I want to see reproduced on YouTube, i.e. I grade it, I master it, we sign off on it, and then I pull it up on my phone, or I pull it up on my iPad, which happens to be right nearby here as well. That's where I want to see as close a match as possible to what I saw here. Does that make sense? My GUI is kind of a different subject of like, if you're using that GUI to make grading decisions and then wanting to see the same image on that GUI in a different context on your web browser, that's more difficult and also less meaningful, because it just depends on the color management pipeline of your operating system, the settings that you've chosen in there, whether or not you have that little box checked that I just talked about inside of Resolve. There's all these variables there, and ultimately, just because it matches what you saw in your Resolve, it doesn't mean that it's right or that it's going to give the best possible reproduction for the greatest number of viewers, which is always my gold standard for web viewing or any other viewing. I want to give the best possible reproduction for as many viewers as possible. So the recipe for that, to wrap all this up and put a bow on it, best recipe for that, grade on a calibrated reference monitor that's being fed by an output from a dedicated card, so that you're bypassing whatever operating system level color management there is. Grade in that context, and then apply my web viewing LUT if you are rendering for YouTube. And what you're going to find when you do that is, on the whole, when you compare your reference monitor image, what you all signed off on, what you used to make your decisions, and if you pull in a lineup of someone's iPad, someone's TV, someone's cell phone, someone's iPhone, someone's, like other mobile device, what you're going to find is that you are getting a reasonably good match across all of those devices back to your original reference monitor. Not an identical match, because those are not calibrated devices, but that is a system for succeeding in terms of getting a meaningful alignment between what you signed off on when you were grading and what you're seeing out there in the wild. That's a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of things to think about, but that if you take nothing else away from that little spiel, take away that last little bit. This is exactly why we need calibrated external reference monitors being fed by dedicated cards that are not subject to operating system level color management. It's because it gives you an image that you can make creative decisions on, that you can have the highest confidence are going to travel on across all the many different devices that your image is ultimately going to be viewed on.
Let's go to the artistic side of color grading for a bit. What is a situation to use the glow effect? It is a good practice to use glow effect at the timeline level. And also, just for fun, I would like to ask, how would you compare the glow effect to the classic halation?
Yeah, so let's talk about like texture and halation and all that good jazz for a moment. Let's go over here to some of these red images, because I feel like these will give us a good opportunity to explore this subject. So if we think about like glow and halation, To be honest with you, I'm going to open up Glow for the first time in a while. I haven't played with this in quite some time. So definitely the use case that I would see if we think about like whether we're talking about glow or halation, and in a minute, let's look at the difference between those two things and what they might net. When we're talking about glow and halation, really what we're talking about is, where I see those things being most useful is in shots like this, where I've got very hot sources. And I'm actually interested that right now, I'm seeing this kind of burning in my image here, which is kind of the first thing that needs to be dealt with. Like this is like at the very far end of a spectrum of like something I'm always trying to look out for when I'm grading stuff with these kinds of like sources in frame. I want them to feel soft and integrated, and the worst case scenario is that there's actual like a hard edge living somewhere inside of there. So let's actually just try something out here and make sure that I'm actually going to try an input DRT here and just see if that helps. This is these images are part of a so-called kind of torture test that are designed to produce gamut errors. Oh, here we go. Let's try this. We talked about timeline working luminance last week, so you can revisit that episode if you want to know why or what exactly I'm doing by increasing this number. But let's see if I have any idea what I'm talking about. My hypothesis is that when I hit save, I'm going to see less of an ugly edge there. Ooh, it's actually a more ugly edge. Interesting. Well, let's take a quick detour here, guys. I think this is kind of a fun thing to troubleshoot. This is going to be step one in our process that we are going to go through right now of like trying to really incorporate and sort of like cohere our hot saturated highlights into the rest of the image. So let's try this input DRT at luminance mapping now that I've got this set up here. And that's still not happy. I'll show you guys another trick. We're doing true freestyle here. We are going to compress our highlights, or compress our gamut maybe, right here within DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. So I'm going from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And what I want to try to do is kind of fold this burned highlight into, I want to get more of a uniform texture here if I can. And I don't know exactly where this is coming from, but I'm going to try some different options. So we're going to say custom max output of 10,000 and set the custom max output at the same. And then I'm just going to start walking this down and seeing if I can't get a better result there, which I'm not at the moment. So let's try some gamut mapping. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Maybe I could still get it even cleaner if I wanted to. Like I could bring my knee and max values down even further, but this is what I was looking for. You see what I'm talking about here? It might be a little tough over YouTube, but I really want that, like that burned edge. That's like the worst case scenario, the last thing that I want to see in a highlight or a practical frame in source, a specular, if you will. This is like the worst case of it. Here's a much better version. And I feel like this is pretty localized. It's not affecting my lower saturations too much. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now we can continue on and talk about texture, because this is also a great example. I'm just going to label this of a shot where I might potentially want to soften these like specular practical sources even more and kind of integrate them even more into the frame. So you could look at using your glow. And if I like, drop this shine threshold here and maybe take that spread down a little bit, like maybe that's helpful. You can kind of see like the glow has a more diffuse quality to it than what we're going to look at in a moment. I'm just going to turn this opacity all the way up. And let's just do a quick comparison. I'm going to grab a still on this. And then we could also, yeah, and you can see shine threshold here. That's just determining how bright does a pixel need to be before we start to produce a glow around it. So let's set it maybe somewhere around there. And then let's just visually compare this to the halation plugin. I'm just going to kind of like, I'm not trying to produce any particular result except for a softer, more integrated practical or specular highlight into the frame. So here's halation, which obviously has a color right off of the bat here, right? And we've got similar things in terms of like, where's our threshold, and like, you know, the parameters that we can operate within here. And we can look at like the how strong we're getting here. We can look at the spread. In general, like halation is much more localized than the glow, isn't it? Which isn't necessarily good or bad. It just is. So that could be an interesting thing to play around with and just look at these different parameters. To be honest with you, as you may be able to tell, neither of these are plugins that I use all that much, even though I do regularly want to tame in the glow on things. But, you know, you guys tell me. I think you might have to feel it out shot by shot, but I feel like this is doing kind of that same thing I wanted, of just sort of softening out and integrating my highlights a little bit more, but I might prefer this. I want to like keep playing with this, the spread of this and these other parameters, and talk about just feeling your way through it. That's exactly what I'm doing right now. Maybe go back off a little bit on that saturation slider, but I think I prefer this to that. That's just kind of my take, my preference. Although I do like that the glow is completely nuking the last of that little nasty edge there. So that's just a quick visual comparison on one arbitrary frame of, you know, one solution versus the other. But I think they both can have merit, and to me the merit of both of them is to take speculars that are in the source and integrate them in the way that you would see a specular integrated in a film source. Because in a film negative, you would have highlights that by the time you're pinging that film negative with like a practical source in the frame, you would have highlights that are going to roll over and compress and soften in a way that in a digital system, you have to introduce that softness. Let me turn that off. You have to introduce that softness, if that makes sense. So you can absolutely do that, but you have to do it, as opposed to it being innate and in fact something you can't avoid it with. If you're shooting film negative, you're going to get roll off in your highlights baked right in, and you actually can't invert or linearize those highlights very easily, because that's just the way that the organic compound responds to the stimulus of the original scene. So I hope that's some interesting thoughts on glow and halation. And then the last thing that I'll point out to you guys is, again, when you are working in a color managed setting, while we're here, let's just go ahead and let's get some vibe on here. There we go. We got a 2383 on here. Doesn't that feel better right off the bat? And let's say we like this idea, but we want to play with it a little bit more. What you might be able to try, I haven't actually done this with the glow plugin, so if it backfires, don't hate me. I'm going to try flipping this over to linear, okay? Nah, that doesn't work so good. So what you might want to do instead, if you wanted to do a kind of like custom glow, this is closer to something that I would actually do. You could set your luminance, like do a luminance qualifier here, nice and soft, nothing sharp, and then just do a blur over here. Crank that blur way up and set your gamma to linear, like so. What you may find is that that blur integrates with the rest of the frame a little bit more organically, a little bit more like that's actually what the camera originally captured, as opposed to something that you're doing after the fact. I feel extra rambly today, but I hope these are all interesting little side missions that I'm taking us down this morning. What else we got?
We have a super interesting question from Gabriel. Why do we try to reproduce limitations of camera systems, like making the inside of the neon lights less saturated, when in reality, is it pure color?
Ooh, this is a really fun question. Why indeed? We could look at it from the historical POV and say that there's a large portion of filmmakers who are essentially, whether or not we conceive of it this way, we're essentially film apologists. We say that the photochemical tradition, at its best, at its peak, in the hands of the most skilled practitioners, represents the absolute zenith, the absolute like high watermark of what is possible and what should be done in the capture, manipulation, and reproduction of motion images. That's like a big school of thought. And it's such a big school of thought that it's an idea that we don't even articulate all that often. But that's like a huge school of thought. That's, like, even if you look at like the analog intermediate thing, that it's become quite popular in the last couple of years with films like The Batman, and with Dune, other films that are actually going through a film negative as their intermediate after they've been shot digitally, just to get that magic of what the film system did. Now, I want to be clear. I actually happen to like both of those examples I just gave. Those end images look great. So whatever they did, I don't get a vote. It looks freaking awesome. And I went and saw both of those movies more than once. So job absolutely well done by the production and the post teams there. But there is an underlying philosophy underpinning such practices in our industry that says, hey, film is the standard. Film is the gold standard. What film does is what we want. And if film doesn't do it, we don't want it. You follow what I'm saying? That's the, I think, most concise answer for like, well, why is it that we do seem to have this sort of bias or base expectation that big, hot neon highlights like this would sort of like be rendered more creamy and lower in saturation than they actually were on the day? That's, to me, the fundamental reason why we have that bias, is because that's what a film system would do to those highlights every single time. Because remember, in a film system, in the upper portion of our tone scale, when we're getting brighter, when we're increasing contrast above middle gray, which all film systems do, we're going to naturally lose saturation. We're going to bleach. So that's just innate of a film system. No real way around that. And as a result, that's an aesthetic that we're all quite used to. I mean, you can even see it in this 2383 film LUT that I applied, above and beyond whatever we were doing here earlier. Like if I turn this off and I turn this on, I'm getting a lot of what I was trying to accomplish with my gamut mapper right here in my 2383 model. Like it's still living there a little bit, but especially when I combine them, when I turn this on, things are getting bleached out here. There's still some color, but it's much lower, much more sort of pastel secondary than what these tubes looked like on the day. You follow what I'm saying? Now, here's the fun part. Once we uncover that assumption and we state it out loud, we can choose to either accept or not accept that idea. And we can say, there are certain jobs where I subscribe to like a traditional sort of filmic palette or filmic aesthetic. And there are other grades where I'm like, I don't care about that at all. I want to see, for example, these neon tubes render with all of the intensity that they had when the scene was acquired. That's like a really fun thing to think about. And this to me is where something like HDR becomes really interesting. As you guys know, I've talked about this before, I don't necessarily care about like, oh, before we had a peak of 100 nits and now we have a peak of 1,000 nits. And isn't that great? And isn't it great that you can now reproduce any old highlight that used to rest at 100 nits at 1,000? My answer, personally, creatively, artistically, no, that's not great. I do not want to see highlights that used to reproduce at 100 at 1,000. I find that painful. I find that aversive as an end viewer. Something I find really interesting, however, is let's say we're in an HDR system and I decide I'm going to use that HDR system as an artist in a sort of different way than we typically talk about. I'm going to use that HDR system and say, okay, my nominal peak white, because remember, I can get as bright as 1,000 nits, right? And I'm going to just elect a speed limit. This is something else that I talked about with Eric White during our conversation in the Masters of Color podcast. I'm going to sort of self-impose a speed limit and say highlights, diffuse white, what my friend Steve Yedlin calls scene white, that's going to live at 250 nits, 300 nits, wherever you decide to park it. You've got a scene white that's parked there, but because of the HDR system that you are in, if you would like to have a fully saturated color at that luminance level, or even brighter, if you want to have like a pure ass red that's at 500 nits, you can do that in HDR. And that is closer to the way that neon out in the real world actually reproduces to our eyes. Neon, in addition to being more saturated, actually feels brighter than what we would generally think of as a white object in that environment. You follow what I'm saying? So if we can sort of let out and expose in the light of day this idea that like, oh, film aesthetics are the only aesthetics or the best aesthetics, and anything that doesn't conform to them is bad and shouldn't be considered, and we should be confined to film aesthetics. There's nothing wrong with that. Lots of great work gets done under those assumptions. But if you can air them out in the light of day and say, well, what if that wasn't the case? What if there was something interesting to be had beyond what a film system might have been able to do? Then you can ask interesting questions and come up with what I think are interesting answers, like the one that I just talked about of like, what would that look like? What could that look like? How could that be interesting? How could that be used to tell visual stories in a different way than we've ever had the opportunity to do in the past? So, something to think about.
All right. A question from Jim Robinson. How do you deal, what steps do you take to analyze the footage, especially when the footage is not as well shot, like in documentaries where the crew shows what they can? How do you decide how to tackle the footage?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I'd actually love to hear Jim's answer to that. But I'll give you guys my thought. You know, the first chapter of my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, is first do no harm. So I have what I would describe as I tend to err pretty conservative with my color grade. I don't care how much of the image, what contributions I can make to the image, how much better, quote unquote, I can make the image look with my hands. If anything that I'm doing is imposing damage or making some part of the image look worse than it did when we started, that to me is a hard bargain to accept. Generally, I want only value adds. Maybe those are big, maybe those are small, but I only want to add value to the picture. I can't, I try to take that Hippocratic oath, first do no harm when I'm grading. I really don't care about improving things if in the process I'm damaging things or compromising in some way. So in short, that's how that initial sort of survey or assessment of the material is guided for me, is I just look at like, okay, what's in there? What can I do? Where does the image break? Where is it brittle? Especially in documentary, which is a great example. One of my favorite films that I graded this year is a short documentary called Barefoot Empress. Beautiful story. I'm such a fan of the story. I really, really love it. And it was shot in a fairly remote part of India using available cameras and available technology. And it's delicate material. It almost makes me think of like, I don't know, like archaeologists, like digging up, like bones. They have to be very, very careful about unearthing those bones and pulling them up out of the earth without damaging them at all. That's kind of how that project and how a lot of nonfiction projects can feel. You're like, all right, I've got to be very gentle and very delicate. If I can make it look a little better or guide the eye a little more or enhance the story or frame the story a bit better, great. But I can't damage it in the process. I have to be very careful. Now, of course, the fun part is, unlike an archaeologist, if I break something, I can just undo that, which is awesome for us as colorists. But that's my process, especially with more delicate footage, is just to take that initial survey and feel through it and look at, all right, for this specific job, what are the tools at my disposal that are consistently allowing me to get free gains? It's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for free value adds, meaning value adds that don't cost anything to the image. So if it gives me a richer contrast, but it slams shadow detail off into oblivion, that would be a simple example of a compromise that I would prefer not to make in the first place. So that first survey for me is all about assessing for this job, what are the manipulations, what are the tools where I'm consistently able to add value without introducing any compromise or damage to the image. So I hope that helps. That's a fairly open-ended question to answer in the chat, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, Jim. And if you don't make those into the chat, then post them in, I don't know, reply to one of the community posts about grade school today or in an upcoming video, because I think that's a fascinating question to ask. All right, guys, we've managed to hit our time in short order. Thank you guys so much for being here for another freestyle episode of Grade School. I love doing these with you guys. I'm excited to share. We've got some new content that's going to be coming out really, really soon. As you all know, I'm working really, really hard to sort of reimagine my work life, or as many of you guys know, those of you who receive my emails. If you don't receive my emails, go sign up for any one of the cool things that I offer up for free, and you'll start to get my emails. And those are really just my reflections on the profession of color grading, the craft of color grading, and what it means to be an artist moving through the world and trying to navigate this crazy business. And you can get those freebies. And if you hate those emails, you can, of course, unsubscribe. But if you want to hear from me and hear about you know, what I'm talking about with trying to reimagine my work-life balance, then go grab one of those freebies, and you'll hear from me and all of my adventures in my life and my profession. But because I'm trying to scale back my hours and get more focused and more disciplined about the way that we do things here at Cullen Kelly Color, we've had a couple weeks off of releasing new videos, but we're going to have some new ones coming out really soon. Some really good ones, I hope. Some really good ones, I think, that I really think you guys are going to enjoy, and I'm excited to hear everyone's thoughts on the topics we're discussing. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, we're going to keep up with grade school. I'm always excited to end my week and start my weekend with you guys on a Friday morning. Y'all always show up with great questions, great ideas, great passion. So thank you as always. Thanks to Rafa for being my co-host with the most. And I hope you guys have a great Friday, great weekend, and I will see y'all very soon. Take care.